Lex Occultum is a tabletop RPG published by RiotMinds Games in 2018. Its theme is gothic, supernatural, 1700s Europe. The game comes in 2 books, Lex Libris, or Game Master's Guide, and Alter Ego, the Player's Guide. I'm going to cover content from both books, but I'm actually going to skip the mechanics of the game entirely and just discuss the game's setting. The reason for this is that I feel the game's rules are a bit inaccessible. There's just a lot of granularity that didn't appeal to me, and I want to stick to the positive here. If you're like me, you're a bit of a do-it-yourself GM, and you're used to scavenging games for their best elements to fold into your rule set of choice. That's why I'm doing this video, to show you the aspects of Lex Occultum that I find to be very inspiring and usable in your game. Quick word about the sponsor for this video, Arcknight, the creator of flat plastic miniatures. I found it easy to embrace their whole ecosystem of tabletop gaming products, starting with the flat minis, but expanding out to the spell effects and the dozens of different double-sided laminated maps they sell. The spell effects are particularly useful for tactical games like D&D, where distance is critical in terms of the game mechanics. You get instant visualization on range and spread of the different spells, either for quick reference at the table or for continuous reference depending on the spell duration. Thanks for Arcknight for sponsoring this video. You can find a link to all their stuff in the description below. Now, back to the review. Lex Occultum is meant to present a dark 1700s Europe struggling its way out of darkness. You play a truth seeker, such as a mathematician, philosopher, alchemist, or scientist, or perhaps a tradesperson, who is likely a member of a secret society or cult. You face physical danger in the form of vampires, werewolves, and spirits, and you're only armed with your wits, some flintlocks, maybe a saber, and some finicky spells. Players in this world will find themselves at odds with, among others, agents of the church, who believe end times are near. There's actually a whole lot of explanation of what the church is and why it believes what it does. When I first started reading the history section of this book, I kept looking for connections to the game itself. Only very occasionally do the authors refer to the game while they lay out a sprawling history of Europe. The intent in this section is to get the GM caught up to the 18th century. Due to the dark layout and dense text presentation, it can be a bit challenging to read, but it lays down the foundation of the setting in a system-agnostic way, and very thoroughly at that. The Europe that is presented is mostly historical, but the book makes it clear on multiple occasions that it's supposed to be an alternate version of Europe. It's a version where the superstitions of the church and the dark magics of the heretics are actually real. There are many pages dedicated to the fabric of society of 1700s Europe. It's definitely interesting to read, but I came away thinking that all of this stuff seemed written completely independent of an RPG, and again, that's fine since it is the one thing I'd salvage from this game and plug in elsewhere. The only caveat is, a GM would do best to read all of this section in order to get a full picture, but as for the cities and secret societies, those can be cherry-picked. The book sort of staggered me with how many cities it detailed. These are only about 1 page apiece, but it is dense reading and full of rich details for a setting. If you're a student of history or a native of Europe, some of these details may not seem so novel or exotic, but it's undeniable that the 1700s were interesting times and makes for a great backdrop for a dark, investigative RPG. Despite the fun details, covering a European city across an entire century in 1 page is pretty much impossible. You definitely get usable details here, but to bring a city to life as a GM, you might have to do a bit more supplemental research. The other major section where GMs don't have to take it all in at once is the one on secret societies. Again, I was amazed by the detail here and often wondered how much was fiction versus how much was based on real history. Take the Freemasons, for example, which gets a little extra special detail in the book. You read about each stage of initiation going up the ranks of the organization. Then the rituals take a sharp left turn into something that is at once dark, silly, and creepy. I won't spoil it here, but I'll say it involves rear ends. If you take into account this section on societies and the previous sections on history and civilization, this GM's guide stands as an indispensable sort of game-agnostic primer on Gothic Europe in the 18th century. Not for proper academic learning, of course, but for RPG settings. This Lex Libris book covers supernatural beings only in the broadest of strokes, detailing werewolves, phantoms, specters, wraiths, and vampires. That's it. It's like half a monster mash here. But I approached the whole thing as a DIY GM, so this bare-bones bestiary didn't bother me that much. I did find the vampires a bit overly designed, but the door is open for GMs to come up with their own flavor of vamps or any other gothic monstrosity to torment players with. The book presents what is essentially magic as 3 different secret arts. There's the dark arts, like sorcery and witchcraft, which is divided into white magic, black magic, and divination. Then there are the divine arts, where religious belief springs to life with holy spells. And finally, the scientific arts, which by and large are substances that need to be prepared by the players over hours or days. There aren't a ton of spells in the book, but that's because they are hard to assemble and cast. Each has material components, and most have some ritual that can take up to a month or longer. I hate to use the word realism here, but these arts do have a sort of gritty plausibility to them, at least relative to the roll to cast type spells in most RPGs. The only thing I hoped to see but didn't was any sort of penalty for failed casts or attempts. The second book that makes up this game, Alter Ego, details how to build and equip a character. Again, I'm going to gloss over all the mechanics. I really just want to quickly point out the thematic contribution that the character archetypes bring to the setting. Each of the archetypes come with 3 or 4 example professions or roles that a player can assume. I found that the descriptions for each of these is couched deeply into the time period itself and really does reinforce the social environment of 1700s Europe, at least in broad strokes. In the interest of harvesting this game for its setting, it's worth mentioning the equipment section of the player's handbook. There are lists of clothes and accessories for men and women, and a few brilliant pages on how to actually operate 18th century firearms. This might be my favorite aspect of both books, since it highlights just how cumbersome these weapons were, and how they're probably horrible for fighting monsters. And of course there are lists of basic firearm and melee weapons, and common gear. Okay, so here are my thoughts on Lex Occultum. Cons. Mechanics are complex. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, I think the game's rules are too complex for their own good. It's a clone of the basic role-playing or BRP system originally published by Chaosium and employs a skill-based roll under D20 paradigm, but for reasons I don't want to belabor, I just think this version of BRP gets a little labyrinthine. Hard to read text. You are 100% not going to want to print this PDF at home. I read the PDF on a digital device and actually still found the light on dark text and the heavily colored page backgrounds an impediment to reading. In a similar vein, I found the massive text blocks to be a bit daunting, but the writing is good. Pros. Well-established theme. The history and rundown of each European city in the 18th century and the secret societies are all gloriously well researched. In the end, it presents a sandbox environment for the GM to work with. The limited bestiary drives that point home even further. The GM has to do some heavy lifting here, even if they want to use the native game mechanics. Artwork. All the artwork in both books is evocative and fits the dark, haunted European setting very precisely. There are also a number of great glyphs or symbols scattered throughout that I think could be used in any game session involving secret societies or the arcane. I feel incredibly unfair taking a cutlass to this game and hacking away the mechanics. I know the authors spent a lot of time trying to hone it in and playtest it, but it was just so easy to separate it from the rest of the game. I think one day I might circle back and take a closer look at the social hierarchy stuff included in the rules, but for now I'm just basking in the detail and the breadth of the setting. No matter what rule system I'm using, if I want to run a gothic European supernatural mystery, I'm going to use LexOccultum as the foundation for it. As always, thanks for watching. This is Dave signing off. See ya.